When installing engineered hardwood flooring, there are multiple options to choose from when it comes to color, but there are also multiple options to choose from when it comes to the installation method. And on this project, we have multiple scenarios, whether it's on the substrate or the fact that we're also installing it on stairs.
For this project, we had two different installation methods because we have two different subfloors. This one is an OSB subfloor, and down there we have a concrete slab on grade. That means we're going to be actually nailing this in place and gluing that in place. But we actually are all starting right here due to the fact that we have stair nosing we need to install that's adjacent and connects into our wood flooring. This is important because of the fact that it's going to be very highly used and highly seen, obviously. So we want to make sure that it looks as good as humanly possible, but it also is as structurally sound as possible. So let's get to materials and then we'll get to installing.
This is the stair nosing that we're going to be utilizing for this project from Flooring Direct Warehouse. Now the beautiful thing about this material is that not only is it beautiful and structurally sound because it's an engineered hardwood flooring product, but it also matches our flooring perfectly because it's made of the same exact product. I'll be going into much further detail about this product when we actually start the stairwell, but in the meantime, let's go and get our staircase fully prepped out and ready for installation. This entire area was completely carpeted before I got to it, and luckily for me, I didn't have to worry about removing the carpet, which was a nice added bonus to take on this project. But because this stairwell area was carpeted, it means that it doesn't have a proper finished look, which basically means we need to do some prep work before we even get to flooring. Luckily for us, all we have to do is remove the front lip of the stair nose, which in the industry they call out as a carpet nosing on stairwells. Once that's taken care of, we can then measure our stair nosing to the appropriate length, mark it, and cut it. And as you can see, I did add a bit of painter's tape just to make sure we had the cleanest cut possible. We do have some stair skirts in this circumstance as well, so I measure and mark those out and cut them with our table saw. And you don't have to use a table saw, but because these are going to be finished cuts, I want to make sure they are as clean of a cut as possible. I of course double check our measurements and make sure that it fits very snugly, and as you can see, it did. But now that we have this first piece of nosing taken care of, let's go ahead and bust into our flooring. This flooring has been in the home for over 48 hours, which means it's been acclimated properly, and we can get right into installing it. This product is from Flooring Direct Warehouse, and I'll make sure and leave a link for this specific product in the description box below. With most hardwood flooring projects, you generally want to go off of a very straight wall that's a large wall in the room, which I will be doing and showcasing on our lower level slab on grade area. However, because we're starting off with a nosing, we need to do the difficult part first, and then we get to the easy part. This first piece of flooring is going to be wrapped around the wall that's adjacent to the kitchen, and therefore I measure and cut out a perfect section with a jigsaw. Just remember the edges of these cuts don't have to be perfect due to the fact that wall base will be right on top of it. In order to make sure that our flooring is perfectly square all the way across the room, I want to make sure that this first board measures the exact same length from one side to the other, and if that's the case, then we know that we'll be perfectly square all the way across the room. But before we install any flooring, we have to do a bit of prep work. And the first thing is to make sure you run a vacuum over the entire surface to make sure we have a beautifully clean work surface to work upon. Now it's time for underlayment. And for underlayment, we're using this cork base underlayment. This is a superior underlayment, and it not only provides a layer of protection for the subfloor and the flooring, but it also provides some thermal aspects as well as has a 6mm vapor barrier. It's extremely easy to cut with a sharp utility knife, and once I have it positioned correctly, I can then permanently position it with a few staples. And when I say a few staples, like quite a few staples all the way down, because you don't want to tape the seams based upon the manufacturer's recommendations for engineered wood flooring to an OSB subfloor. The main tool I'll be using for the entire installation of this project is going to be this Bostik floor staple nailer. Now this thing takes 16 gauge 2-inch long staples, which provide extreme strength and durability when it comes time for us to actually nail these boards in place. Now we will be using this for the vast majority, but there are a couple sections where we're going to need adhesive, and that's where Bostik's best adhesives comes into play, because this is one of the gold standards of flooring adhesives. For the stair nosing, we're not able to use the nailer that I just showed because of how it actually positions itself onto the wood. Therefore, we actually have to glue these pieces down first and then top nail them into the corners because any corner penetrations won't be seen due to the fact that there's going to be wall base there. I insert a flooring tongue into the groove side of the nosing, and therefore once we install our flooring right into it, it's going to be a perfect fit and will last for years to come because we have strength of adhesive as well as nailing once we have it all in place. Just make sure you wipe up the excess glue as quickly as possible with a clean cloth and then finish it off with a bit of mineral spirits, which will take care of the rest. Once we top nailed the corners, I then grabbed our flooring nailer and nailed down the first board. And as you can see, this is why I did this, because we have a perfect nosing to full board transition, which would be impossible to get if we started on the opposite side of the room. I top nail the corner in place to make sure it doesn't move when I actually use our floor nailer, and once I have this first board in, I butt our second piece of flooring right up against it and then top nail that corner. Now behind these two pieces of flooring is going to be our base cabinets for the kitchen, but the owner doesn't know exactly where the layout is going to be and what type of appliances they're going to have, so we decided to go ahead and just go over this area with the flooring to make sure and guarantee that we didn't have any issues down the road, because normally you'd find plywood underneath your kitchen cabinets, but instead we're going to guarantee that we have a beautiful hardwood floor all the way across. After we apply our adhesive with a 1/4 inch V-notch trowel, I then position the tongue and grooves into each other and with a little assistance from our pull bar. This pull bar makes it extremely easy to get into tight knit areas to make sure that our flooring is as snug as humanly possible. But in some areas, of course, we do have to cut the boards down to size. And that's where the table saw comes in perfectly, because we can run our boards all the way through at the correct depth and then also use our pull bar to get them snug, and then finally tack them in place with our nailer around the perimeter, because again, those nail holes will be covered up by our wall base. At this point in time, I do also highly suggest installing a few flooring shims around the perimeter, because we want to guarantee ourselves that there's no movement for any of these sections as we install the rest of our boards. As I'm installing all of these boards, you will also notice that I'm using a unique mallet, and this is actually specifically a flooring mallet because it has a soft tip end, which is a soft face that protects the floor and the nailer as we're hitting it, but it also has a very hard, dense side, which gives it just a little bit more love tapping capabilities. Once we go across the entire room, we finally get to the point where we have one fluid row of flooring all the way across the room, which is a big step because now we can really get to nailing. After you install a few rows, you do quickly understand that you're going to need some help when trying to hammer all these boards in place. In order to make it as easy as possible, I actually cut 3 pieces of equal length of flooring, nailed them together on both the top and the bottom side, and you have this perfect little block. This little block adds a lot of weight and punch when you're actually hitting your floor mallet into it, and therefore making it much easier to get these boards in place. And that's what we want, because we want a perfect seam all the way down each board when it connects from board to board. As you make your way through the room, you will find some obstacles, just like this one, and in order to get around this obstacle, I just make 2 little marks on both sides so I know exactly where I need to cut. I then extend those lines all the way across the board and bring it to my table saw, where I can get a perfect cut all the way down the long side, and then use my jigsaw to cut the shorter side, which just makes life easier. And again, remember, those cuts don't have to be perfect because they're going to be hidden with the wall base. Just try and make sure you provide a bit of breathing room, because you do want 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch of wall space between the wall and the wood flooring. That way, if this flooring does surprisingly move over time, you have a bit of space. Luckily for us, engineered hardwood flooring doesn't move that much compared to solid wood flooring, but it can move over time. A few key notes about this flooring nailer is that it is connected to my air compressor, and you do have to dial it in somewhat, because if you have it dialed too high, then the nail itself might actually go through the tongue. But but if it's set too low or you hit the nailer too gently with the hammer, then the nail might stick up and you have to actually pound it down or remove it altogether with some pliers. As for a proper staple or nailing pattern, I actually nail a couple inches away from each end and then every other 6 inches. That might be a little excessive for some, but I want to guarantee ourselves that we have proper installation that won't come loose over time. As noted before, this is a nailer that utilizes staples, but you can use just a regular nail in order to adhere these boards down in place, but with staples you get twice the penetration for a single hit, and I appreciate that. Another item that you want to make sure you're accounting for is the seams, and you want to guarantee that all these seams are at least 6 inches away from each other if it's from board to board, but you also want to make sure that the seams that you have don't align with other seams down the line. That will provide you with a random variable pattern, and therefore your eye won't catch something that looks odd or unnatural, because we want a natural look and feel to this entire space. In a perfect world, we would always have a room that's square with 90-degree corners, but we don't live in a perfect world, and therefore some type of unique corner variance is always going to come up in the vast majority of wood installation projects. Luckily for us on this project, I checked with our speed square and we have a 45-degree angle adjacent to all of our straight walls. Therefore, the angle was extremely easy to figure out. It was just a matter of making sure we were cutting that at the appropriate angle with our chop saw or our jigsaw. Once we hit these large open spaces, it was extremely easy to install the vast majority of all of this flooring, but you do have to realize that this is a living room and kitchen, and therefore we have quite a few things we need to move around. Personally, the best and easiest way to take care of this is to maneuver all the items from one side of the room to the other once you have half of the room done. Therefore, you are able to keep them in the same space, but you're still able to work around them quickly and easily. Just keep that in mind on your next flooring project. The only other obstacles that we really have in our way at this point are the vents. Yep, we have a few vents that we have to take care of and account for, and the jigsaw makes quick work of the vent hole, which makes the installation portion extremely easy. And with a little over half the room done, I quickly realized how incredibly gorgeous this flooring truly is, and it is completely transforming the overall look and space. I wanted to say a big, huge thank you to everyone that is watching this video and has supported the channel along the way. We're getting really close to 500,000 subscribers, and if you're not subscribed, please consider doing so. Because ever since the beginning of this channel, I've been dedicating myself to help other people learn how to build along the way. And that's exactly what I want to do for the next 8 years. If you find yourself in a position where you can't use your pull bar to minimize the seam between the ends of each board, then use a piece of painter's tape. Apply that to one side and then hold on tight, because as long as you apply a bit of pressure laterally, that seam will stay in place and you will minimize the overall gap. As you get closer and closer to your finish line, you will quickly realize that you're running out of space for your flooring nailer. Therefore, I actually take my other nailer and position it at the appropriate angle in order for me to shoot nails into the top of the tongue. Therefore, I'm applying a row of nails that fully secure the board in place. I have to do this to the last couple rows of our installation, which also coincides with the last 2 vents that I have to install. This floor vent actually fits perfectly within the width of one of our boards, and therefore I pre-drill my holes first and then go around it with our jigsaw. These edges will be covered up eventually with the floor vent, but you do want to protect these boards as much as possible, which is why I applied some blue painter's tape first. The nice thing about this circumstance is that I was actually able to use the hole with the pull bar in our flooring mallet to make sure that we had them fully snug up against our adjacent row.
So you know how I can actually confirm that our spacing was correct? Because that vent over there had the same measurements as right here, because we had 3/4 of an inch here and 4 3/4 of an inch right here. Same spacing on this vent and that vent, which means we're perfectly square. Woo! Or rectangular, one of the two.
A simple measurement like that truly makes the world of difference, because it guarantees that this floor was installed perfectly square, and it all started with that very first row. So keep that in mind and just remember how important that very first row truly is. Our last row of flooring is just a couple inches wide, which is why I run a few pieces of flooring through our table saw at the correct width, then position them correctly and top nail them because, again, the wall base will cover up any nail holes on top. As for the door entry, I did have to be a little bit more accurate in these locations because these are going to be finish cuts that you will see the sides of at some point because the trim doesn't go all the way around here. Therefore, we have to have a very nice snug fit, which we do, and in the areas where I can nail down flush, I do. After I made our way around the doorway, it was a straight shot to the end of the wall, and the only other tool that I haven't talked about is this small pry bar. It really did help, especially in some tight-knit areas, so get one of those, and as always, I'll make sure and leave links in the description box below on all the tools and materials seen in this video. And speaking of materials, this is an area floor vent. Super slick and unique design, which actually incorporates the cut off pieces that I had for the vents. Don't throw these out because these do come in extremely handy because we're going to use a scrap for the center of our vents. And to make it look super easy, all you have to do is make a few measurements and cut 4 sides perfectly straight. I find that taking the first 2 or 3 cuts first on the chop saw and then going through with the table saw at the tail end to make sure we have a perfect width is the easiest way to get this matched up. But because this tray is a bit deeper than our engineered hardwood flooring, I do have to cut a small piece of scrap plywood and insert that first into the channel and then insert our beautiful wood flooring. You can apply adhesive to this box, but this thing fits so snugly that this thing is never coming out. But just remember that if you do run across a section where you have a vent that has 2 pieces running across, you do want to cut it to the same width to make sure it has a cohesive transition between the vent and the flooring. But with that last vent in, we are done with the upstairs. Now, let's head downstairs. We are starting with a rough looking concrete slab, and the reason why we are is because this was an existing carpet area, and when the contractors decided to spray the paint onto the walls, they decided not to protect the concrete, which is why we are the lucky ones that get to remove all of the paint and the texture that is on the concrete before we even get to flooring. And my personal favorite device to remove any type of remnants on this concrete is a diamond wheel that's attached to my grinder, and the grinder is hooked up to my shop vac with this protective shield that goes around the grinder. This makes it extremely easy to remove all this leftover paint on the concrete, but it also makes sure that it's not too dusty in here. It will automatically get some dust moved around here and there, but the vast majority is sucked up into my shop vac. Now, one important step when working with a concrete slab is to test for moisture. And the easiest way to do this is to actually take your grinder, grind down a specific area, and once that area is fully ground down, take a piece of Visqueen with 4 pieces of tape, let it sit for 24 to 48 hours, and come back. If there's no moisture or discoloration into the concrete, then seemingly you don't have much moisture within your concrete, and a glue should easily be able to adhere to it properly for years to come. We have some trim around our bathroom doors and our closet area, which is why I take a scrap piece of the flooring and my multi-tool to remove the excess trim around the door so we can get a perfect fit once we start installing our flooring. Now that we're finally done creating dust, it's now time to suck up and clean this entire slab with my shop vac, and a quick once over is all you need for this entire area. But now that we have our floor cleaned, it's ready for flooring. The starting point of our project for a glue down method is extremely important because all of our alignment is working off of this point, which is why I'm actually making a mark on the floor at which I want the first row to start at, and then taking a chalk line across to make sure I have a completely straight line from one side of the room to the other. On this project, we're using a 1/4 inch V-notch trowel, and for the glue, we are using Bostic's Best, which is a perfect tried and true product for engineered hardwood flooring. Just know ahead of time, this glue is not cheap, but you do get what you pay for because it's a very high quality product. I suggest starting off with a small amount of glue first so you can really work within the space and make sure your first row of boards are perfectly straight right across your chalk line. I position my first board in the glue and just give it a little bit of push to make sure that that glue adheres properly all the way across the board. As I position the second board into the tongue and groove of the side of the first board, I raise it up to a 45-degree angle approximately, and then slide the tongue into the groove end while lowering the board. Since this first row is actually right adjacent to a stairwell, we do have to cut a small section out of this first row to make sure we have a perfectly straight line all the way across our chalk line. After I mark my lines with a speed square, I then take my jigsaw to cut the piece appropriately, and the jigsaw really makes it easy to cut these weird unique shapes and areas, especially with the fact that you don't have to worry if these cuts are perfect due to the fact that wall base will be going right on top of it. When I position pieces like this, I do try and slide it in and then push it down into the glue, but sometimes it's so tight you're going to have to push it down into the glue and then slide it into position. A very important step to do at this point is to position these floor spacers on the back side of this very first row. As you're pounding the next couple of rows in, this will make it less likely that the first row alignment won't get screwed up in the process. I'm going to go into much larger detail about pounding all of these boards in place with the proper tools and techniques, but the main point that I wanted to get across at this time was the fact that you want to get a few rows in and then let it dry overnight. You obviously don't have to do it this way, but I find it's extremely easy to work on a floor if you have a very sturdy surface to work upon and work against. We put some weights on it overnight, and now it's permanently bonded to the floor, so I don't ever have to worry about this section moving as I'm installing the remainder of the floor. Just like our previous nail down installation, one of the key aspects when installing this floor is to make sure you're accounting for the seam locations. Each seam location should be no closer than 6 inches from each other, and you want to make sure that they're all staggered apart from each other. Which in all honesty is quite easy to do since this flooring comes 23 to 86 inches long. Quite a difference. In sections where you have a long straight shot with no odd cuts, you might actually find it easier to stack and align your boards first and then apply your glue. And as you can see, we have quite a bit of glue to apply on this entire floor, which is why we want to make sure we have the proper V-notch trowel associated with that flooring. Keep in mind that depending on the subfloor and the material that you're using, the notch size might differ from installation to installation, so just keep that in mind on your project if you don't have these exact materials or subfloors to work upon. The main tools I use for the installation is a pull bar and a sizable mallet. This makes the installation process extremely easy, and installing it this way actually is much faster than trying to nail it down, at least with my personal experience. This is mainly due to the fact that when installing via the staple method, the staples tend to damage the tongue in some locations and therefore made it harder to install. But with this method, the tongue and the groove is perfect and therefore it slides in with a breeze and makes the installation process much faster. But you know what doesn't make the installation process fast? Yeah, cutting around doorways, but that's okay and understandable because you're going to have those issues. I always find, again, using a speed square to determine exactly where the depths are, marking my lines appropriately, and then using my jigsaw makes it extremely easy to make those cuts around the doorway sections. I do suggest dry fitting these pieces in first, and then as long as you have it at the right size, you can then position it appropriately with adhesive. You don't want to get this piece in while there's glue down and then realize, oh yeah, I need to make a new cut. Not fun. This is also the first area where we installed flooring under existing trim work, and as you can see, it slid in perfectly the very first time underneath our existing trim and provides a perfect finish in the end. As you work yourself into larger, more continuous spaces, I suggest making it easier on yourself and just pouring out a large amount of glue onto the surface and then spreading it accordingly with your V-notch trowel. Once you get to the tail end of your bucket, I basically just flip it over onto its end, let it rest there for 10 minutes, and then you come back to a glorious mob of glue that was at the bottom that would have taken a little effort to do if you had to scrape it all out yourself. So let gravity work for you on this project. But with all this glue comes the fact that you will be getting some of it on the floor no matter how hard you try not to. The best part that I've found thus far to remove this glue is just some mineral spirits and a clean cloth, and as long as the glue is still wet, it's extremely easy to remove with this, but even if it is dried on there, you can still fully remove the glue with mineral spirits and a rag, just might need a little bit extra oomph. And when I say oomph, that basically just means more rubbing. As I get close to my next doorway, we do have to be a bit unique in the installation process because we have to get underneath both door casings, but when considering the tongue and groove aspect as well as where we're positioned, it tends to get a bit tricky. But the way that I was just doing it is to actually have your seam right in the middle of the doorway. That way you can slide one side in and position that piece correctly. Once that piece is positioned properly, you can then cut your second piece. But the trick about your second piece is that you cut the bottom of the groove side that's going to be adjacent to the seam that's right in the middle of the doorway. In order to make this cut extremely easy, I just set the depth to the appropriate size, and that just slices off the very bottom portion of our groove on that side. This way we're able to slide the board in place underneath our door casing while also fitting it into the groove side on the back side, but it also snaps in place in the very middle of our doorway because we cut the bottom groove out. I also place a few floor wedges on the back corner here in order to guarantee that our floor won't be coming apart or adjusting as we install the remainder of our floor. As you can see, we had a large couch in this area, which was quite a bit cumbersome to try and get upstairs and out of the way, so we just put it on one side of the room and then moved it back to the other side once we installed up to it. This provided a really nice, easy solution for this room, and we didn't have to go up the stairs with a very large couch. Flooring Direct Warehouse is the sponsor of this week's video, so if you are interested in this type of flooring specifically, or any other type of hardwood, vinyl, turf, or carpet, then please make sure you check out the link in the description box below. As we butt ourselves up right to the very last row of our wall, we seemingly are able to fit a full board at this very section. Pretty incredible, and as I used before, you still want to apply your floor wedges to guarantee that none of these boards come loose throughout the drying process. Now, if you're wondering why we're installing engineered hardwood flooring up to the fireplace, please note that this fireplace will be removed and actually replaced with a gas zero clearance fireplace, which means we don't have to install any type of fireplace hearth throughout this area. This provides a bit more of a modern look, and after we have a few more wedges in place, guess what? We are done with our second room, but we aren't done with this entire project because we have some stairs that are connecting these two rooms together that desperately need to be refinished. And this stairwell, as you can see, is very roughed up due to the fact that they sprayed their texture and their paint all over them. This is obviously due to the fact that they were carpeted prior to this, which is why we need to remove the front stair nosing as well as clean up all these surfaces. I take my tape measure and mark a line based upon the depth of how far our tread nosing sticks out past our riser. We do this because we want the entire rise section completely flush, which makes the installation portion of this project much easier because we already have a stair nosing that matches our hardwood flooring. I measured and placed a stop block that is attached to the stair tread, and this way I can butt my circular saw right up against it and therefore have a perfect clean cut all the way across. Okay, well, not all the way across because eventually your circular saw will hit your stair skirts, but that's where the multi-tool comes into play because I'm able to quickly and easily remove the remainder of the stair nosing with my multi-tool. My makeshift stop block is just adhered with 2 screws, one on both ends, and once that's secured, you're easily able to take your circular saw and run it all the way across. When you're coming back for the remainder, just try and make sure that multi-tool is cutting straight. Sometimes it's not the straightest tool because it bends, but you're easily able to remove any excess as needed. This is a fairly quick and easy process as long as you have the right measurements, and as I work my way up, it's the same exact thing over and over again until I get to the very top, because the very top has carpet still, and instead of a tread, we are working with OSB. The only thing I'd like to highlight at this point is just to make sure that you're adjusting the depth of your blade so you're not potentially cutting into your riser as you cut off the lip of this OSB. I do a quick sweep of our stairwell and then grab my grinder with a quick strip disc. Now this disc is normally used for metal, but it's a perfect disc to use when trying to remove paint and texture off wood. I also have a dust shroud attached to my grinder in order to encapsulate and enclose all of the dust that's created that's also connected to my shop vac. That way the vast majority of all these particles are being sucked into my vacuum and not spread throughout the entire house. One nice feature with a shield like this is that you can actually take one side off and get extremely close to the side of the wall. Now, I can't get all the way there, but with a small amount like that, I just take my multi-tool to remove any excess that I don't want. After I take care of all the treads, I do go over the risers, but I'm less worried about the risers because there's not going to be much pressure and use on them compared to the treads. And speaking of treads, this is the perfect time to remove any squeaks or squeals that you find when walking up and down your treads with a few screws.
Now that we have all of our prep work taken care of, we now have a proper surface to adhere our boards to. Now we have to actually figure out what our alignment is going to be and what our layout's going to be for our flooring that's going to act as our risers and our stair tread. First things first, we're going to actually be installing our stair risers first, which is going to butt up against this surface. Then we'll be installing our stair treads that butts up against it like this. This also accounts for the fact that we have an amazing little nosing that we're going to actually adhere after the stair risers in place, so it perfectly matches up and we don't have to ever see that edge anytime soon. The one tool that makes life a lot easier in this circumstance is this. This is a jig specifically for stair treads and risers.
And the way it works is that it's fully adjustable on both sides, so it can determine the exact length and angle that you need at every single location. Now, this is normally used for the stair treads, but this also comes in extremely handy when doing the risers, especially if the sides of your walls are not straight. Now that we know our exact dimensions, I can then start on my materials. And for our materials, it's so nice because we're just working with the same flooring that we did previously in our other 2-room installs. I cut 2 pieces of flooring, but I do cut them an inch long in order to account for angle adjustment. Then I pound the tongue and grooves together, making sure they're aligned, and set up my table saw. Based upon the height of my riser, I do subtract about 1/8 of an inch because we don't have to have it perfectly aligned with the riser. And once we have our piece cut to the appropriate height, I can then take my template and mark the exact angles needed on both sides. Just make sure that both bottom corners align with the bottom panel and cut it to size on both sides. And once you have both sides marked appropriately, you can take it to your miter saw and cut both ends. In all honesty, on this staircase, one side was almost perfectly 0 degrees every single time, but the other side actually did have to have a slight adjustment. About 1/2 degree was all I needed, but that degree did count for quite a bit, especially when you want a perfectly flush fit. This stair jig really does do an amazing job at templating the exact sizes. Just make sure that those bottom corners are on the same plane, basically meaning that they are touching the flooring or the tread below it at the same time. Now it's just the same process over and over again, cutting the wood 1 inch long, tapping them together, putting them through the table saw, then coming back and applying the template to the wood, and then of course cutting the ends at the appropriate angle. I was pretty conservative by making sure I wasn't cutting too much off, and therefore I did have to make a couple extra cuts, but most of them slid perfectly in place just like this. Since these cuts are so vital, you want to take your time and patience when actually measuring and cutting everything. So it does take a bit of time and energy to do that, but the process itself is extremely easy, and as long as you have the patience to do it and the tools, you can for sure take this on. But now that we have all of our risers taken care of, it's now time for our treads. The treads start with our nosing because that's going to determine exactly where each piece of flooring needs to be placed right behind it. There are floor manufacturers that make full-size treads, but those generally are extremely expensive, and this is a great way to not only have a great look, but also a cheaper option. I cut the nosing in 2 floorboards long, just like I did the risers, about 1 inch. And once I have these 3 sections taken care of, it's now time to put them all together. Now I found 2 different ways of cutting these treads. The first way was to actually just take these 3 pieces and assemble them appropriately together. After they're all assembled, I secured them as one fluid piece with just a few pieces of painter's tape. That way I know for certain that the seams won't move on me over time. At this time, I grab my template jig and place it right on top of the tread. Same thing as the stair risers, but on a flat surface, and making sure that we have the proper angle and pushed right up against those stair skirts. I then place the template right on top of our tread and make the appropriate lines. Just make sure the tip of your template matches up with the tip of the nosing. I set my table saw to the correct depth, then run the entire panel through the table saw. This automatically provides me with the exact depth that I need for this entire tread, and now all I have to do is cut both sides of the tread to the appropriate length. As noted before, you may have to do some slight minor adjustments to the angle in order to have the appropriate cut for our template line. Most of our angles were between 0 and 1 degrees, but there were a couple angles that I needed to get a little bit more drastic on, which was a 2 degree, and a 2 degree might not sound like a lot, but is drastic when you consider the size of these treads. I make sure the tread fits snugly in place and then grab the upper riser and use that as a template line to where I need to make my final cut. Now that the template line is determined, I can then take that template, bring it back to the table saw, and cut a perfect line all the way down. I reposition the tread to make sure that it fits snugly with both risers in place, and as long as that's taken care of and we are a good fit, we're good to move on to the next piece. And as for the next piece, I'll also show you how I cut the second piece that's a little bit different than how I did the first one. However, the same scenarios occur in the first few cuts, making sure that I'm cutting the nosing and the two pieces of flooring at the same length, but making sure that they're approximately an inch longer than needed. Where the process changes is that I take the measurement from riser to riser and determine how thick the back panel needs to be for the stair tread. This way I have the length predetermined for our stair tread, and after I have all three boards assembled properly, I apply my painter's tape to hold the boards in place and then use my tread template to guarantee that we have the proper angle over the entire span. The keynote to add when templating this space is just make sure that the alignment on the back point of your template is the same on both sides. I place the template right on top of our stair tread, align the edge with the front of our nosing, then place our line onto the boards on both sides, cut them at the appropriate angles, make any adjustment needed on both sides, and again, one side may differ than the other. Once both sides are taken care of, you can then position it snugly, and away you go to the next one. As I work my way up the stairwell, nothing really changes till I get to the very top, where I have to address the transition between the nosing and our carpet. Because we have stair skirts, we have to maneuver our way around that and into the upstairs hallway. We do this quickly and easily by taking the width of the hallway and then making a few marks to cut out the sections needed for our skirts. This has to be a very straight and orderly cut, so I'm actually taking the table saw miter gauge and using that to make sure we have a perfectly straight cut all the way across. After we have both sides taken care of, I then bring it back to our stairwell and make sure that it fits perfectly, and once that final piece is guaranteed to fit, we are ready to start applying our adhesive. The adhesive we'll be using for this project is Bostic's Best Adhesive, and this is the same adhesive that we used for the flooring. Now we're using this adhesive because it's expensive and we have a little bit left over from our flooring, but you can certainly use a general construction adhesive if you don't have one of these just lying around. The application process is very similar to our wood flooring process because all I'm doing is using a 1/4 inch V-notch trowel to go over the entire surface and then installing our flooring, or in this case, our stair riser. In order for us to guarantee that these stair treads and risers don't move on us while we're working our way up, I actually picked up this slick looking Milwaukee pin nailer that is battery operated, which is extremely easy to install these nails, and I'm just applying it to the very top of this area in order to make sure that the boards don't move on us during the curing process. The best thing about these nails is that they're 23 gauge headless nails, which basically means you barely even see the hole where the nail penetration occurred. After I have the first riser taken care of, I then proceed to applying our adhesive to the first tread as well as the second riser. That way I'm able to kill two birds with one stone, and the application of the glue is actually a little less messy if I'm applying it to both surfaces at the same time. I install the riser first and then the tread, but I don't actually nail the riser before I install the tread. I actually am just trying to make sure that everything is fitting snugly and nicely, and you might need to grab a rubber mallet and just give a few love taps to make sure everything fits tight and then nail it in place. That way you know all the seams are at the appropriate locations, as well as the fact that the seam between the stair tread and the riser should be as seamless as possible. As you're making your way up, again, same exact process, apply the glue to the stair tread as well as the riser above it, install the riser, then install the tread, push it into place, give it a few love taps, nail it in place, and move on to the next one. As a general side note, I do apply a few extra fasteners to the very top row on the riser because you're never going to see it once the stair tread above it is positioned properly. Once installed and nailed down, I remove my blue painter's tape and move my way up the stairwell. This is actually extremely quickly as far as the installation process goes because everything is already pre-cut. Just make sure you either number your stair treads and risers or you don't mix them up, because if you put one in the wrong position, it won't fit properly and it's a mess to get up. I did it once and I never want to do that again. After I apply my glue to the top of the stairwell, I then place the last piece of nosing in this stairwell, make sure it's fully set and secured appropriately with a few more pin nails, and then proceed to some carpeting. I'm certainly no carpet master, but I did install a tack strip at the very end of this run, and after I remove any of the excess padding needed, I can then stretch some of the carpet at the very tail end and use a sharp razor blade to cut the exact amount needed while using the nosing as a guide for my razor blade. Now, of course, there is a secondary stairwell that is much shorter, which is a lot easier to do and manage, and I won't go over the entire process because the entire process is basically the same thing. But there was one key difference with one of the stair treads randomly, and that was because one of the stair treads actually had a very unique angle to it. And in order to accommodate this variance, I had to freehand my cut on the table saw and make sure it was as straight as humanly possible. Not the easiest thing to do, but just be careful and take your time when doing a cut like that in order to have a perfectly straight line all the way across your beautiful stair tread. But this was basically the only difference between the two stairwells, and therefore, after we have all the treads and risers cut, we glue and fasten them down appropriately and then move on to filling. And as for filling, we are using this Roberts wood floor filler. Now, we didn't have many seams, but there was this one seam that I just did not like, and it was a little bit excessive. Therefore, I just squeezed a little bit of this filler in, goodbye seam, and away we went. This can also be used for any of the nail holes that we had to accommodate for, but as we discussed earlier, the pin nails really don't need to be filled at all because of how small they are. But now that we have both stairs fully completed, we are done with this entire project. This was an incredible amount of work, but I am truly impressed with how warm and inviting this space is now that we have this beautiful engineered hardwood flooring attached to it. Whether it was the upstairs, the downstairs, or the stairs itself, every single area had its own challenges, but it is truly one beautiful, sexy beast of a living space now. Oh yeah,